Hi, Michael Denner here, Stetson University, Russian Studies, and I'm joined by an old friend, John Davis, somebody I got to know a few years ago in Illinois, at the University of Illinois, doing research at the library there. And John has some really interesting perspectives on the current pandemic here worldwide in 2020 because he wrote a book called Russia in the Time of Cholera that charted the series, I guess, of seven outbreaks of cholera in the Russian Empire in what is, for all intents and purposes, what historians call the long 19th century, starting at around 1825 and finally petering out sometime at the end of the 1920s. No, 1921, 1928. Anyway, you'll give us more information.
Yeah, correct.
Russia dealt with a series of pandemics for the better part of 100 years, and I wanted to pick John's head a little bit about cholera, a disease that's still persistent in parts of the world, but that caused a lot of misery and a lot of death. Millions and millions of people died in the last couple hundred years from cholera outbreaks in Europe and in Asia. And also, I'm really interested in hearing what John has to say about the effectiveness of various approaches to ending pandemics. And he has a special perspective on this because before he became my colleague and an academic, John spent at least 20 years as a police officer in northern Kentucky. So he has a unique perspective. I doubt one that's shared by very many people about this current pandemic because he was a first responder for much of his life. And then he studied academically a pandemic in Russia. And so I'm hoping to hear what he has to say, not only as an academic and a scholar of the cholera outbreaks in Russia, but also as a beat cop for 2 decades for the better part of his life. So let me ask John to introduce himself, say 2 minutes about yourself, and then we'll launch into a discussion of cholera, Russia, and Russia in the time of cholera.
Sounds good, Michael. And first, it's very good to see you again, hear from you again, and now see you again. My name is John Davis. I grew up and was a policeman, as you said, in northern Kentucky, at the city of Newport, right across the river from Cincinnati. I was a policeman in 3 jurisdictions up there: the city of Dayton,
That's
County,
particularly tough territory, man.
and Florence.
Yeah,
It could be at times. We had our. I remember one year in the early '90s where we're actually leading the area, including the city of Cincinnati itself, in bank robberies out in Florence. That was the year of, I believe, Average Joe. You might remember. The FBI finally chased him down. He lived in our city, but I've since retired from the police force. I studied Russian history at the University of Kentucky with Karen Petrone, and had a really great group of scholars there to study with. Went on and taught a little bit at Ohio State and the University of Kentucky, and now I am a assistant professor at Hopkinsville Community College, which is about 60 miles north of Nashville, just by the Fort Campbell Army Base. In fact, we have a campus on the Fort Campbell Army Base. I've been there for 6 years.
So John, I'll cut straight to the chase. What's it like to die from cholera?
It's a terrible, horrible death. This is not one that you want to choose because you feel that tremors and you start to have convulsions and and very quickly, within 2 to 6 hours, you can be dead of all the body fluids in your body basically leaving your body, throwing up, vomit, passing it through the oral. You catch it through the oral fecal route, so it comes out the fecal route itself. It's a gastrointestinal disease. So some of the symptoms are that you just throw up. You have horrible cramps, and as somebody who's experienced some pretty bad cramps in my time, I can't even imagine. Your whole body just cramps up to the extent that even after you're dead, you move a little bit. Your eyes sink in the head, the skin turns blue. It's actually called the Blue Death. It's a very terrible way to die.
Jesus, that's terrible,
It's
John.
awful. Yes.
Um, okay. Um, so you write in your book that, and I'm working from memory, which is always quite fallible with me, that about 5 million people suffered from cholera in the course of those 7 epidemics, and that about 2.5 million of them died, which seems to indicate that the morbidity rate of cholera is really significant. In other words, that if you get it, it's pretty likely that you're going to die this absolutely horrible death that you just described.
Yeah, just under a 50% chance. You have about a 40% in a lot of epidemics, particularly the earlier ones, 1830, when the stronger vibrios were dominant. The vibrio is the bacterial agent. You got about 40 to 50, sometimes 50 and even 60%. So, I mean, you can imagine the terror. I mean, everybody's afraid now during the COVID-19. This was far more terrible because nobody knew how to do anything about it. And it killed 1 out of every 2 people almost. And
There were
it was
7 of them within 100 years. So roughly every 15 or 20 years, right?
That's correct. There were 7 of them. Well, actually, the seventh was not until the 60s, 1960. So there were 6 throughout the long 19th century. And I concentrated on the 6th, actually.
That's right. So you concentrated on the one that occurred after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1921.
Well, it began actually in about 1896, did not get into Russia until 1902, and continued to come in on and off until 1924. Was the really it followed the Civil War and all the wars and famines that Russia had.
So I have a question. What was it like to be in the midst of a epidemic, pandemic? I guess this was strictly speaking an epidemic. What was it like to be in an epidemic during the 19th century in Russia?
Well, it was not a pleasant thing. Probably there's a famine going on because it's closely related to famine. So you're already hungry, and often you had people were dying and you don't know why. Uh, you notice on the cover of my book you have the Tsarist guard and the people. You had cholera riots, and so they actually rioted and went outside because they were so terrified at this. They turned their fear outward against the authorities who could not protect them. It was a very wild place in those days, and particularly in times of cholera, it just really horrible. I mean, if anybody's seen the movie Love in the Time of Cholera, it's just ghastly time to be alive. And of course, the very last epidemic, the 6th pandemic in the 20s, was just terrible because you had the Russian Civil War going on, and as Don Riley has proven. I mean, it continued right up through 24, and the cholera just basically followed the battlefront in the famine down into the Saratov region and then out into the east in some of those areas out there. It was really bad. It is. I mean, if you've watched Dr. Zhivago, you've got an idea how terrible it
Oh,
was.
that's right. I'd forgotten completely that Zhivago takes place during the time of a cholera epidemic, and
Well, yeah.
that he treats. It makes me want to reread that frankly second-rate novel. So you list some interesting causes for the cholera outbreaks, for cholera generally, and for each of the outbreaks as well. And I'm going to read to you from your own book. In the 19th century, imperialism, warfare, religious pilgrimage, revolution, and violent social upheaval, migrant labor, and other forces spread the disease yet further through endemic and semi-endemic regions and into temperate zones. That's a striking list there, because if you were to list the reasons for the coronavirus spread it would just be these in many respects. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the ways that the pandemic spread in Russia as cholera and the way that it's spreading now, coronavirus now globally.
Sure. It for one thing, one of the reasons it was so bad is because it was very or close to the source, which was India at the time, or in the Bay of Bengal and in that region down there between Bengal and Indonesia is where they almost always originate. They come off the mountains of Mount Everest, and the water come down through into the estuaries, which is where disease are havens for disease, actually, without getting too technical about it. But this was at the time of imperialism and warfare and trade, massive trade to promote industrialization, increasing trade. And the trade from India to the West came through the Volga and the Don River, right?
Mm.
It either went through the Don or the Volga generally, or through Odessa and one of these places into southern Europe, Eastern Europe.
Like America.
And this is where cholera followed. It followed the lines of transport. And this is why Russia, which was a food supplier at that time, suffered so much and was so feared because everybody thought, oh, it's coming from Russia. It's a lot like they talk about China right now. It had nothing to do with the Russians, but it got almost a Russian myth about it that this was a Russian disease, which it was not. It actually had they called it India cholera, but even that doesn't take into account all the conditions under which cholera starts. It could really start anywhere if there were similar conditions. It's a epidemic of poverty and conditions. Not getting enough to eat, having to eat poor food choices and things of this nature. So it comes up the lines of travel, and modernization actually promoted it. You have the Mariinskaya system of canals, which promoted it and brought it up to Petersburg, the building of St. Petersburg, and then west as more and more the trade went up to Petersburg. It actually, one of the worst places actually was Rybinsk, which was just east of Moscow, which was like a jumping off point for trade east of Moscow, which was not connected, by the way, to this. I mean, you had to you had to go overland or early on.
Right.
You didn't have a canal there. And then you went up through the canal system. But as the trade increased over the century, it became harder and harder to stop. And so the problem kept changing. And it was very difficult for them to deal with. And it did bring a lot of fear. And you're right, at least 5 million cases. The 1848-49 epidemic alone, you had well over 1 million cases. So I would think 5 million even. That's not even the 7 pandemics. That's the 6th. And I'm always skeptical of those statistics. They could be higher.
So I'll point out that one of the things that you just said that's so interesting is mitigating. The people in power were faced with a decision very similar to the decisions and the conundrum that current leaders are facing about a trade-off between control of disease and a suppression of market and economics, right? And so very much so there's this trade-off between if we control it, we risk doing significant economic harm to ourselves. If we don't control it, we risk doing significant economic harm to ourselves. And so plus ça change, right? Like we're talking about 100 years difference, and we're talking about a different disease spread differently, one caused by bacteria rather than by a virus. And yet it's fascinating to think of pandemics and endemics as market problems. And your observation is that it was that in the 19th century in Russia, just as it is today globally with the coronavirus. So I have I read your book, and one of the things that I noted that you didn't really bring out that much, but you did a little bit, is the ways in which subalterns, people who were not part of the majoritarian culture, were repeatedly blamed for spreading the disease and causing the disease. So the Bashkirs and the Muslims, so I wonder if you could make any observation. Maybe there isn't any observation other than to make the same observation, which is plus ça change, right? The more things change, the more things stay the same. But it seems to me that we're already in the midst of making this the China virus, the Kung flu. And there was an article in the New York Times about how Chinese Americans feel under attack on the road because they're worried about people are worried about the Chinese spreading the disease. Any other insights? Any other examples of this that you came across in your research?
Absolutely, Michael. There's a lot of examples of that. Eileen Kane wrote a very good book on how cholera and the czar. I mean, cholera was a main theme in it, but it really was not. It was about the Hajj and how the Hajj clearly promoted it. It went right through the endemic lands, and so if you're going on the Hajj, and you live in India, you're a potential carrier. You may even be likely to die. So you had a lot of bunts, a lot of riots against Muslims during that time, and actually part of it, and this brings in the imperial part again, where as Kane really brilliantly draws out, that the Tsarist Empire incorporated the Hajj into the empire, right? They were actually helping them near the end, and giving them increases in passports. So the more they did this, the more they did become a multicultural empire, the more it really spread the disease. Again, it's not a Muslim disease, because who did the Russians often blame for it? Was the Jews. You had riots against the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, in some of these places where the Jews lived in some pretty mean conditions, by the way, as you know, in the cellars of some of these places, in the Baltics and in the Pale of Settlement. Often the physicians were Jews, and they said, well, why don't the physicians get sick? This is a conspiracy, right? I mean, these conspiracy theories are nothing new. So they would attack physicians, and they did attack and kill many physicians, several, and a lot of physicians, just like our physicians today, were getting sick. So that, and they were not alone. And in 1892, some Jewish folks landed along the Hamburg-America lines in New York, and were unable to land as armed thugs with clubs would not let them off the boat. So yes, they got the minorities always seem to get the brunt of the wrath.
Yeah, it seems important to me to remember that in the late 1920s and 30s, in what was to become Nazi Germany, Jews were segregated and accused of spreading disease, and people why were they taken to showers? Well, the root of that has to do with the idea of cleaning the unhygienic, the dirty foreigners, and
Mm-hmm.
Jim Crow as well in America. Why did the black people have to sit in the back of the bus, and why couldn't the black people swim in the same swimming pools, and why couldn't the black people drink from water fountains? And again, because they were considered to be particularly disease prone or carriers of bacteria and viri. So let's remember that it's that all memorable, all great, maybe all repression started off as drives towards hygiene and concerns about disease. So, John, we could talk about this for hours, but we really only have about
Yes.
10 minutes left. So I have a question, which I'm really eager to hear the answer to, and I think that you're uniquely qualified to answer, since you were a first responder, since you were a cop, a beat cop, as a matter of fact, and you're now a scholar of pandemic and epidemic in Russia. What do you What what do you think should be the response, or shouldn't be the response, marrying those two views that you uniquely have, as a police officer and as a scholar of disease?
Well, I wish I had the answer. For sure. I think we're on the right track. One is that we need to stay in our houses. We need to not move around a lot because, as I think I've pointed it out pretty well, movement leads to disease. I mean, and it's very unnatural to stay in your house, but stay in your house and listen to the authorities. I would say don't panic. Um, it's too late to contain it, but I mean they can still inhibit it. They can inhibit the flow, the transmissions, and that's when it'll ultimately stop. When it has no more host, when it runs out of host, it will die. Right? We don't have a vaccination as the Soviets had developed, which really helped a lot. We will for the next time.
Yeah, you talk in your book about them strategically deploying the vaccines to areas that they were concerned were going to lead the outbreak, and but we don't have that possibility because it's a virus for one thing. There's no such thing as a vaccine, particularly for a virus.
Correct.
So go on. I'm sorry. Did you?
No, we just don't know. I mean, to contain it is like they were able to, but I think probably, I mean, and there's a lot of epidemiologists, very smart epidemiologists studying this right now. I think where it threatens to develop in mass, and of course the port cities, and there's no coincidence that it's in Washington and that it's in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Los
ports
Angeles.
always get hit first.
Yeah.
So those are some of the points where they could maybe inhibit the spread a little bit. But you need a strong government response is something I would also say. A lot of folks are hung up on this. Will the private market will handle it, or will only the public market can handle it? We better have both, and that's what the Soviets had. They had, even Lenin was smart. I mean, who's as doctrinaire as anybody you could ever imagine, was smart enough to know that he had to bring back private markets in the NEP during the 1920s, and he did that after he had grain ration throughout the war. But he brought back in 1921 for the really almost the duration of the Civil War, private markets, and this I think had a lot to say about the disease just literally not falling off the map, but drastic reductions in disease. So I think the private market and the public market.
Did Lenin? Are you suggesting that in part Lenin's decision to bring about the Novoye, the NEP, NEP was driven by his understanding that it would help to mitigate the cholera epidemic in the Soviet Union?
That was part of it. The hunger. The famine was more important to them, though. I mean, by the Soviets, what they really understood was that the struggle with the Borbas Hilaire became the Borbas Gulodom. So it was really the struggle with famine, and when they started feeding people and allowing private markets, disease fell off the. It as quickly as it had skyrocketed, it fell. And you also had these response teams going on. That was important too, who contained it, which were able to contain it, I should say, and that's how they inhibited it.
So I'm gonna butcher this, and so you need to correct my version of your book's analysis of the most efficacious countermeasures against cholera. You say something really interesting to me. You said something like they finally managed to defeat the disease, contingently, of course, when they understood the human gut as part of a environmental of an ecosystem. And it was only at that point that Russia was able to conquer the disease. Did you want to say a little bit more about that? How did I'm sure I butchered it a little bit.
Well, I think that's correct. I mean, they not only looked at what's going on in the intestines, they started monitoring local populaces for, okay, now we have these light gastrointestinal diseases. Now they're getting worse. Now we have a few deaths. This isn't even cholera yet, but they knew cholera is going to be here. So this was part of their early warning system. Actually, is we need to get prepared because cholera is coming, and they knew it was coming in June or whenever it came, maybe a little bit earlier. It usually hit its high point in July in August and started falling off. But yeah, but they could tell by the human gut tract, and it had a lot to do with whether the person probably got the disease or not. I mean, there may be some very smart epidemiologists that tell me, no, you really are not right about this, but humans are part of the ecosystem, and yes, I mean, cholera can live in bays, it can live in estuaries, it thrives in estuaries, and it can live in the human body, and so they started to understand that this was all linked. As one scholar said, they even early on in the 1870s, they viewed the Russian people as an elemental soil. I mean, I think that was a really brilliant way to put it. And Lisa Walker was her name, and I've never met her, but that I did a great dissertation out there at Berkeley on it.
One last question. So people have made a connection between the outbreak of this coronavirus and global climate change. Typically, the connection is proactive in the sense that this economic hit that we're bound to take, as well as much of the world's economy going offline for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, will actually have a profound influence on the future global climate change. But there also have been people who have drawn connections between climate change and the outbreak of the coronavirus. You make a lot of not necessarily global climate change. I'm not quite sure that would be the right word, the right phrase to describe it in the 1880s, 1890s. But you nonetheless connect the outbreaks of cholera to profound changes in the environment that were caused by El Nino and by volcanoes. Do you want to say a few words about the connection between disease and climate?
Yes, I'm actually following there some of the scholars who are more adept at that than I am, and I sort of fed on them. Mike Davis is one of them. Gillen D'Arcy Wood up there at Illinois Urbana Champaign. I've never met him. He's in the English department, I believe, still up there. Wrote a wonderful book on Tambora, the volcano, and talked about the early cholera epidemics. Even early on, Roderick McGrew, who wrote a book on cholera in Russia in 1965, was talking about the climate in Indonesia in the 1770s and the first cholera there. So he was really onto it way back then. But you would get the El Nino and the warming in the oceans and the changes in the salt in salinity, and then you would get tidal changes, probably as a result of volcanoes in the Sunda Arc of Indonesia and in the Bay of Bengal. This would kick up nitrogen and bottom sediments and disease when cholera lays in these places in a dormant state, and then it gets into the bellies of shellfish. Copepods carry it, and I believe they carry it. And this is something that Pasteur, who I think was a genius. I think a lot of people are not geniuses who are claimed to be, but Pasteur was. He knew about anaerobic and aerobic environments, and copepods they're able to operate in anaerobic and aerobic environments. And I really believe that probably has something to do with this, because it comes down from the bottom to the top and gets into the gut tracts of other shellfish, which, if you have a famine going on, of course, people are going to eat. And Mike Davis, in his article on A World's End, Imperial Droughts, and Victorian Holocaust, just portray some horror scenes in India of people who got sick. You know, you had a lessening in the water and lakes and inlets, and reaching down and eating some of the fish and just dying in droves. Millions of people died. Something like 25 million people in India died of cholera between about 1897 and 1925. And sometimes in just rows in families where they were eating just lined up. Mike Davis portrays that in very vivid form in some of his work.
You know, this outbreak of coronavirus reminds us in a weird way of how connected human culture still is to nature, and in many respects, it's an eruption of nature into what we had thought was humankind civilization, and we had drawn sort of a strong line between them. That's nature and this is
Exactly.
civilization. And what you just said, it's so resonant. The way that cholera spread from an eruption of a volcano to people dying in droves in India. There's a direct connection, and much in the same way that this virus, which everyone now realizes probably originated in bat intestines, and is now killing people all over the world. So fascinating. So John, at the end of our, I'm gonna end this great discussion, and I'm gonna ask you after I hang up for the names of 3 or 4 great books for people to read who are interested in scholarly approaches to epidemics and pandemics, and of course your book as well. And thank you very much. It's been a great, very insightful conversation. You stay on the line. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you, Michael.